The rain had only just ceased when the Arkwright family carriage rolled through the rusted iron gates of Wycliffe Hall. The vast estate stretched before them, shrouded in a mist that clung to the ancient oaks and damp stone walls. The great house itself loomed at the top of the slope, its dark windows glinting like watchful eyes. Margaret Arkwright pressed her gloved hands together as she peered through the window. At 17, she had imagined their new life in Yorkshire would be filled with fresh beginnings. Yet the moment she saw the crumbling gargoyles and ivy-choked turrets, a shiver crept down her spine. Her father, Lord Henry Arkwright, spoke cheerfully of restoring the house to its former glory. Her mother remained silent, her gaze fixed on the drive as though it stirred a memory best left unspoken. The servants were already inside, their lanterns flickering through the entrance hall. Margaret stepped from the carriage and felt the cold stone beneath her boots. A sudden gust swept across the courtyard, carrying with it a faint echo. It was neither wind nor bird, but something that resembled a whisper, low and drawn out, drifting from the shuttered windows above. Margaret froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound vanished as quickly as it had come, swallowed by the silence of the night. She glanced upwards, certain she had seen the brief glimmer of a candle in the tower room, though she knew it had been sealed for decades. Before she could speak, the great oak doors creaked open. The housekeeper beckoned them inside, her expression unreadable. Margaret followed, her heart pounding, as the shadows of Wycliffe Hall closed around her. The first night at Wycliffe Hall was restless. Rain tapped against the high windows of Margaret's chamber, and the air smelled of damp stone and dust. She lay awake, listening to the steady tick of the clock upon the mantel, when she heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps in the corridor beyond her door. At first, she thought it must be a servant. Yet the tread was too slow, too measured, as if each step was placed with care. She sat upright, straining her ears. The footsteps stopped just outside her door. Margaret's breath caught. The silence pressed in, heavy and absolute. Then, faintly, she heard the sound of fabric brushing against the wood, followed by a whisper so soft she could not tell whether it was a voice or her imagination. She rose from her bed, wrapped a shawl about her shoulders, and reached for the candlestick. The flame trembled as she opened the door. The corridor was empty, stretching into darkness. Her candlelight revealed nothing but portraits of stern ancestors staring down from the walls. Yet one frame hung askew, the face within half hidden by shadow. Margaret leaned closer. The woman in the painting bore the same features as her, the same pale eyes and dark hair. A sudden draught extinguished the flame, plunging the hall into darkness. Margaret gasped, stumbling back as the echo of footsteps began again, this time retreating swiftly towards the far end of the corridor, where the tower stairway lay hidden. She dared not follow, yet she knew with a dreadful certainty that someone, or something, wished to be seen. The following morning, sunlight spilled weakly across the Yorkshire hills, though it did little to ease Margaret's unease. At breakfast, her father spoke of hiring more men to tend the grounds, while her mother sipped her tea in silence. Margaret longed to tell them of the footsteps and the whisper, yet the words caught in her throat. Something told her they would not understand, or perhaps they already knew more than they cared to admit. Later that day, Margaret wandered into the nearby village. The cobbled streets were quiet, and the few faces she passed turned quickly away at the mention of Wycliffe Hall. It was only the old apothecary, Mrs. Fenwick, who dared to speak. "You ought to leave that place, child," the woman said, her eyes sharp as glass. "The hall remembers its sins. It does not forgive." Margaret frowned, unsettled. "What do you mean?" But Mrs. Fenwick only shook her head, lowering her voice. "There are stories, betrayals, a blood debt. Every family that sets foot there is bound to pay." A shiver ran down Margaret's spine. She wanted to press further, but the shop bell rang, and a man entered. Mrs. Fenwick turned quickly away, pretending to busy herself with jars of dried herbs. Margaret understood the conversation was over. As she stepped back into the street, she glanced towards the hills. From that distance, Wycliffe Hall loomed against the sky like a brooding sentinel. For the first time, Margaret wondered whether the house itself was waiting for her return. That evening, as the family gathered by the fire, a servant rushed into the drawing room, pale and breathless. He insisted he had seen a candle burning in the sealed tower window. Margaret's heart sank. She knew he spoke the truth. The following night, Margaret could not rest. The image of the lit tower window haunted her thoughts, and the memory of Mrs. Fenwick's warning weighed heavily upon her. At last, unable to endure the silence, she slipped from her chamber with a candle in hand and crept towards the forbidden stair. The spiral staircase lay behind a narrow door concealed at the far end of the corridor. The lock was old, but to Margaret's surprise, it yielded with a faint click. She hesitated only a moment before pushing it open. The air within was thick with the scent of mildew and dust. Each step groaned beneath her as she ascended the winding stair, the shadows of the banister clawing at her candlelight. Higher and higher she climbed, until the stair ended in a heavy oak door bound with iron. Her heart hammered. For years she had been told the tower room was sealed, yet the latch was loose, and the door gave way with a weary creak. Margaret raised her candle. The chamber was bare save for a single chair beneath the window and a long-forgotten chest against the wall. The air felt strangely heavy, as if it had been waiting, undisturbed, for decades. Margaret stepped closer to the chest. Its surface was covered in dust, but when she brushed it away, she saw an emblem carved deep into the wood, a crest she recognized from the portraits in the hall. Her family's crest. As her fingers traced the carved lines, a sudden chill swept through the room. The candle guttered wildly. Then, from behind her, came the unmistakable sound of the door closing. Margaret spun round, the flame flickering in her grasp. The oak door had shut tight, though she had not touched it. And from the shadows near the chair, a whisper rose, low and broken, as if torn from another century. The whisper lingered in the stale air, too faint to catch in full, yet enough to turn Margaret's blood cold. She forced herself to breathe steadily and turned her eyes once more to the chest. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of yellowed papers tied with a faded ribbon. Margaret pulled them free and saw they were pages from an old diary, written in a slanted, hurried hand. She lit the words with her candle. I cannot forgive them. They betrayed me in my hour of need. They sealed me in this room, and here I wait, forgotten but not silent. One day, the hall shall demand justice. Margaret's heart pounded. The name at the bottom of the page was Eleanor Arkwright, her great-grandmother. The next entry made her shiver. I saw the promise broken, the inheritance stolen. Blood spilled on these stones, and still they deny the truth. The house remembers. The house will not rest until one of our line answers for it. Margaret lowered the paper, her candle shaking. She felt as though Eleanor's eyes were upon her, watching from the shadows. The whisper rose again, more insistent now, curling through the air like a sigh. She wanted to run, to fling open the door and flee, but when she turned, the iron latch refused to move. The door held firm, as if the tower itself would not release her. From the corner of the chamber, the whisper broke into words. A single name, spoken with aching clarity, filled the silence. Margaret. Margaret froze, the diary slipping from her hands and scattering its brittle pages across the floor. The candle flame wavered dangerously, throwing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Her name, spoken in that broken, mournful whisper, still echoed within her ears. She forced herself to lift her gaze to the narrow window. For a moment, she thought the glass had darkened, but then a face emerged upon it, pale as moonlight. It was a woman's face, sharp-boned, eyes wide with grief, hair falling loose about her shoulders. Margaret's breath caught as recognition struck her. It was the same likeness as the portrait in the corridor. The woman looked exactly like her. The figure pressed its hand to the inside of the glass, though Margaret knew no one could stand upon the outside ledge. Frost spread beneath the ghostly fingers, patterns of ice crawling across the pane. The whisper came again, stronger now. Right the wrong, or the hall will take you too. The candle extinguished with a sudden hiss, plunging the chamber into darkness. Margaret cried out, clawing at the latch of the heavy oak door. To her relief, this time it gave way, and she stumbled onto the stair, clutching the banister as she half ran, half fell back down into the corridor. She burst into her chamber and locked the door behind her, her body shaking. The diary pages clung to her hand, a single sentence burning in her mind: "The house will not rest until one of our line answers for it." Long into the night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing again the whisper of her name, and seeing that sorrowful face pressed against the glass. At dawn, she resolved to learn exactly what betrayal had been buried within her family's past, before the house claimed her as its next sacrifice. The following day, Margaret feigned calm as she joined her family at breakfast. Yet every clink of silverware felt unnervingly loud, and her parents' silence pressed upon her like a weight. She could not look at them without remembering the whisper in the tower and the frost upon the window. When the meal was finished, she excused herself, but instead of returning to her chamber, she slipped into her father's study. The room smelled of leather and smoke, its shelves lined with books that had not been touched in years. She searched quickly, pulling volumes from the cases, opening drawers, and feeling behind loose panels. At last, beneath a stack of tax ledgers, she discovered a narrow leather-bound book without a title. Her heart leapt. It was a family ledger, but one page had been marked with a scrap of ribbon. She opened it. The words were neat and deliberate, each line etched with cold precision. It spoke of a land dispute with the neighboring Blackwood family, of debts, and of a betrayal sealed in secrecy. Then Margaret's eyes fell upon the most damning entry of all. To secure the inheritance, Eleanor was confined. The truth buried with her. Her cries silenced, her body never recovered. Margaret staggered back, the ledger nearly slipping from her grasp. It was her family. Her bloodline. They had locked her great-grandmother away to preserve their fortune. At that moment, the fire in the hearth flickered violently, though no wind stirred. Margaret felt a chill race up her arms. She was no longer alone in the study. From the shadows between the shelves, the faint sound of a woman weeping rose, soft and sorrowful, filling the air with a grief that had never been laid to rest. Margaret stood frozen, the ledger pressed against her chest as the sound of weeping grew louder. The flames in the hearth bent low, as though pulled by some unseen breath, and the air thickened with the scent of damp stone and decay. She turned slowly towards the shelves. The shadow between them shifted, and for an instant she saw her again, the pale woman with sorrowful eyes, her hair tumbling loose about her shoulders. Eleanor Arkwright. The apparition raised a hand, pointing not to Margaret but to the ledger. Margaret opened it again, her fingers trembling, and found a final line scrawled at the bottom of the page, written in a hand not as neat as the others, as though added in haste. If the vow is not honored, the house will demand a life in payment. The fire guttered and died, plunging the study into darkness. The weeping ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it rang in Margaret's ears. And then came the whisper, the same voice that had called her name in the tower, but clearer now, edged with sorrow and warning. You are the last. End it, or be taken. Margaret's knees weakened, and she clutched the desk to keep from falling. She understood at last, the curse was no legend, but a debt written in blood and silence, passed from generation to generation. Her family had stolen, betrayed, and imprisoned their own, and now the hall demanded payment. She staggered from the study, the ledger still clutched in her hand. The corridors of Wycliffe Hall stretched before her, silent and waiting, their portraits watching as if judging her every step. She knew then what she must do: uncover the full truth, bring it to light, and break the vow her ancestors had left unfinished. Yet even as she made her vow, the chill in the hall deepened. The house seemed to stir, its ancient timbers groaning. It would not let her go so easily. The sky above Wycliffe darkened as evening descended, clouds rolling heavy across the moor. Margaret paced her chamber, the ledger spread open upon her bed, its words etched into her mind like scars. The curse was no longer a shadowed tale whispered in the village, it was written proof, a crime branded into her family's bloodline. She could not carry it alone. Someone had to know. Summoning her courage, she descended to the parlor where her mother sat sewing by the fire. The room was quiet, the only sound the click of needle against thread. Margaret stood in the doorway, the ledger clutched to her chest. "Mother," she whispered, her throat dry. "I know about Eleanor." Her mother's needle froze in midair. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched until Margaret feared she had made a grave mistake. Then, in a voice strained and brittle, her mother said, "You should not have gone into the tower." Margaret's blood ran cold. Her mother knew. "Why?" Margaret demanded, her voice shaking. "Why did they do it? Why has it been hidden for generations?" Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. She rose, crossed the room, and shut the parlor door with a decisive click. When she turned back, her eyes held both sorrow and dread. "Because, child," she said softly, "if the truth is spoken, the hall will awaken fully. And once it wakes, it will not stop until it claims what it is owed." At that moment, a thunderclap rattled the windows, and the fire guttered low. A chill seeped through the walls, and somewhere in the depths of the house, a door slammed of its own accord. The hall was already listening. The storm raged above the moors, rain lashing against the ancient stones of Wycliffe Hall. Inside, the house groaned as though every beam and nail strained beneath a weight unseen. Margaret clutched the ledger, her mother's words still burning in her ears. "Once it wakes, it will not stop until it claims what it is owed." The corridors were darker than she had ever known them, portraits looming with eyes that seemed alive. She could feel it, the hall was awake. Every step echoed with purpose, every gust of wind whispered her name. She knew where she had to go. The tower. With a candle trembling in her hand, she ascended the spiral stair. Each step seemed heavier, the air colder. At the top, the chamber waited, the window still marked with the frost of Eleanor's touch. The diary and the ledger lay together on the chest, as though drawn back by some unseen hand. The shadows thickened, and then she saw her, Eleanor Arkwright, pale and sorrowful, her form shimmering like mist. Her eyes, so like Margaret's own, pleaded silently. "I know," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "I know what they did to you. They silenced you. But I will not. Your story will be told." The apparition raised a hand, pointing to the ledger. Margaret understood. She tore the pages from it, each one an account of deceit and cruelty, and cast them into the candle flame. The fire flared bright, devouring the evidence of betrayal. The hall shuddered, beams creaking, dust falling from the rafters as though the house itself protested. But Margaret did not falter. "You will not have me," she cried into the darkness. "You will not have another. It ends tonight." The storm outside roared as if in answer. The ghostly figure of Eleanor bowed her head, her sorrow softening into peace. She stepped back, dissolving into light, and with her passing the frost melted from the window. The house gave a final groan, then stilled. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving only silence, deep and clean. Margaret sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. The curse had been broken, not by silence, not by blood, but by truth. At dawn, the storm cleared, and the first light of morning spilled across Wycliffe Hall. For the first time in centuries, the house was quiet. And though Margaret knew its walls still held shadows of the past, they no longer watched her with hunger. They watched with release.